Some autistic people are told they can't possibly have ADHD too, because the traits seem to cancel each other out. One brain that craves rigid routine and predictability, another that craves novelty and chaos. Doctors have said it for decades, pick one. But new research says that logic is exactly backwards, and the people living with both conditions have known that for years. Section 1. What is AuDHD actually? So let's clear this up first. AuDHD isn't an official medical diagnosis you'll find printed in a manual. It's a term the community created to describe something the manuals were slow to catch up on, having both autism spectrum disorder and ADHD at the same time. For a long time, clinicians were taught these two conditions were almost mutually exclusive. Autism was framed as a need for sameness, predictability, deep routines. ADHD was framed as impulsivity, novelty-seeking, distractibility. The thinking went, how could one brain want both stillness and stimulation? Turns out that question was based on a bad assumption, that neurodivergence has to be simple. It doesn't. Research now estimates that between 50 and 70% of autistic people also meet criteria for ADHD. That's not a rare overlap, that's close to a coin flip. And it went unrecognized for so long, partly because clinicians were trained to see one diagnosis and stop looking, assuming every trait belonged to whichever label came first. That means thousands of adults spent years, sometimes decades, with only half the picture. And half a picture makes for a very confusing life, which brings us to what that actually feels like day to day. Here's where AuDHD gets genuinely hard to explain to people who don't live it. The two conditions don't just coexist, they actively pull in opposite directions, inside the same brain in the same 5 minutes. Autism might push someone toward a strict routine, same breakfast, same route to work, same evening wind down. That structure is regulating, it's not a preference, it's survival. But ADHD is whispering the whole time, this is boring, you need something new, why can't you focus on this even though you care about it? So the same person who desperately needs routine also can't reliably stick to one, not from lack of trying, but because their brain is wired to chase stimulation. This is why so many AuDHD adults describe feeling like they're constantly arguing with themselves. One part of the brain wants quiet and order, another part wants motion and novelty. And when those two systems collide, the result often isn't calm, it's paralysis. Task paralysis, decision paralysis, or what a lot of people call shutdown. It also explains something clinicians used to find confusing, why an autistic person could hyperfocus for 6 hours on one niche interest, yet be completely unable to start a simple task like replying to an email. That's not laziness or inconsistency. That's two neurotypes negotiating for control of the same nervous system, every single day. And that internal tug-of-war doesn't just affect focus. It seeps into every emotion, every social interaction, every ounce of energy a person has left by the end of the day. This is probably the section that's going to resonate the most, so stick with me here. Because autism and ADHD traits can look so similar on the surface, clinicians historically diagnosed whichever condition was more visible, and moved on. A hyperactive, impulsive kid who also happened to be autistic often got labeled ADHD only, because the hyperactivity was loud and easy to spot. Meanwhile, the quieter autistic traits, sensory sensitivities, social exhaustion, need for sameness, got dismissed as personality or shyness. On the flip side, a quiet, socially withdrawn autistic child who wasn't bouncing off the walls often got missed for ADHD entirely, because their inattention looked like daydreaming, not hyperactivity. This is especially true for autistic girls and women, who are frequently diagnosed years, sometimes decades later, than autistic boys and men, if they're diagnosed at all. Add ADHD into that mix, and the picture gets murkier still. A lot of adults are now getting diagnosed with both in their 30s, 40s, even 60s, after a lifetime of being told they were just anxious or dramatic, or not trying hard enough. Here's the thing that made this even messier. The DSM itself used to say autism and ADHD couldn't be diagnosed together. That rule wasn't removed until 2013, which means an entire generation of clinicians were trained under a system that made a dual diagnosis basically impossible on paper, regardless of what was happening in reality. So if you're an adult who got one diagnosis and always felt like something still didn't fit, that's not you overthinking it. That's a well-documented gap in how these conditions were understood for most of modern psychiatry. If this is hitting close to home, drop a comment and let us know which diagnosis came first for you. I genuinely love to see how many of you got the second piece of the puzzle later in life. Now let's talk about how AuDHD actually looks across different ages, because it's not static, it shifts. In children, AuDHD often shows up as an exhausting contradiction for parents and teachers to interpret. A kid might melt down over a change in schedule, classic autism, but also be unable to sit through the very same predictable routine because they're bored and understimulated, classic ADHD. Teachers sometimes describe these kids as all over the place, when really they're just experiencing two conflicting neurotypes simultaneously. Sensory issues get amplified too. The impulsivity of ADHD can override the self-protective instincts autism usually builds, like avoiding certain textures or loud noises, leading kids to seek out sensory input in one moment and become overwhelmed by it the next. In adults, it looks different because adults have spent years building coping mechanisms, masking essentially performing neurotypical behavior to survive school, jobs, relationships. That masking is exhausting on its own. Now double it, because an AuDHD adult is often masking two sets of traits at once, suppressing autistic stimming and sensory reactions, while also forcing ADHD-driven impulsivity into a socially acceptable box. This is why burnout is so common in AuDHD adults, often called autistic burnout or ADHD burnout, but really it's a combined exhaustion from constantly managing contradictory needs. Careers, relationships, and daily executive functioning tasks, like paying bills or meal planning, become significantly harder, not because the person lacks intelligence or effort, but because they're running two operating systems that don't always sync. And this is exactly why understanding AuDHD matters, not as a label to obsess over, but as a framework that finally explains years of feeling like you were failing at things that should have been simple. So here's the hopeful part, because this video isn't meant to just diagnose a problem and leave you there. Once someone understands they're navigating both autism and ADHD, support strategies can actually get built around the real picture, not half of it. That might mean structuring a day with predictable anchors, like the same wake-up time and same evening routine, while building in flexibility and novelty within that structure, so the ADHD brain doesn't rebel against total rigidity. It might mean using external tools instead of relying on willpower. Visual schedules, body doubling, timers, or noise-canceling headphones, not as crutches, but as reasonable accommodations, the same way glasses accommodate vision. For parents, this understanding can be the difference between punishing a child for misbehaving and recognizing that the child's brain is doing something genuinely difficult, holding two conflicting neurotypes and trying to function anyway. That shift in perspective changes everything about how a parent responds and how safe a child feels being who they actually are. For adults, getting this dual understanding, whether through formal diagnosis or self-identification, often brings a kind of relief that's hard to put into words. It's not about having more labels. It's about finally having language for a lifetime of feeling like a contradiction. If you've made it as far, you clearly care about understanding this deeply. So do us a favor and hit subscribe, because we're building an entire library of videos exactly like this one, breaking down the parts of autism and ADHD that so many people got wrong for so long. Here's what I want you to leave with. If you've spent years feeling like you don't fit neatly into one category, too structured to be ADHD, too impulsive to be autistic, that contradiction might actually be the answer, not the obstacle. AuDHD isn't a life sentence of confusion. It's a framework that, once understood, lets you stop fighting yourself and start building a life that actually works with your brain instead of against it. If this video helped even one thing click into place for you, do 3 things before you go. Like this video so it reaches other people who need to hear this. Subscribe, because we're covering diagnosis journeys, masking, burnout recovery, and parenting strategies in upcoming videos. And drop a comment telling us your story, whether you're diagnosed, self-identified, or still figuring it out. This community gets stronger every time someone's willing to share. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.